Oh, it is after. Okay.
Yeah, she started singing.
Yes.
And we're up right now, so you can hear what they're saying. Just to let you know.
Oh, what she's saying is being live streamed?
No, we just watched.
All right, you're live, Mommy.
Okay.
Are you going to use the board?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Is that okay?
Set up so people know who you were. It's okay.
Okay. We're going to have an intimate group today. I'm Holly Seerly, clearly, and we're going to today be talking about ADHD. And ADHD in the early 1900s was called I need my glasses. How many of you know what ADHD was called in the 1900s when it was first named? Okay. Da 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 dot 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 dot. An abnormal defect of moral control in children. ADHD, an abnormal defect of moral control in children. The 1900s. So we've come a long ways, and today if we were to name ADHD more accurately, it would be called a disorder of self-regulation, because it's not just the regulation of attention, it's the regulation of energy. Have you noticed that? It's the regulation of sensory input and sensory expression. And it's the regulation of self-control in all kinds of ways. So hence the defect of moral character came from the difficulty with self-control. And we see that in our kids. It's hard for them to control, when you go back to attention, to control where they attend, how closely they attend, and transitioning from attending to one thing to another, prioritizing what they're attending to. So how many of you here are professionals? Okay. And how many of you are parents? Okay. And an ex-student and a teacher and a staff member. So how many of you were here last year? Okay. So last year, when I came back from the conference, I talked a lot about emotional regulation, because that's another piece of self-regulation that often is challenging in kids with ADHD and adults. And the self-regulation difficulties around emotions often have to do with anxiety, but not always. Sometimes it's inflexible thinking, the difficulty of transitioning from one thought to another thought, the difficulty in taking the bigger context instead of the immediate reaction. So this year, there was also a lot about emotional regulation, but it was more focused on anxiety. So I want to talk a little bit about anxiety. Anxiety in learning and ADHD. Anxiety can cause the brain to be a con man. Now, can any of you guess why I'm saying that? No. Yeah?
Leading to thoughts that aren't necessarily grounded in reality?
Yeah.
Like distorted thinking?
Yeah. Thoughts, she said, thoughts that are not grounded in reality. Now, why do we have thoughts that are not grounded in reality? Well, our prefrontal cortex, which is the rational part of our brain, is the last to develop in our own individual development, and it was the last to develop in the evolution of the human. So what happens is that input goes through our emotional system before it hits our rational system. So therefore, you get thoughts that are irrational. How many of you have had thoughts that are irrational? Yeah, and how hard are they to get rid of? They can be really, really hard. So when you've got a disorder like ADHD where emotions, even more than the average bear, emotions trump rational thought, then you've got an extreme case of emotions running the show, emotions hijacking rational thought, and the difficulty in calming those emotions down in order to get to the rational thought. But the filter that hits, that processes, is the emotional brain that processes the first input. It used to be thought that we were a thinking machine that had emotions. Now it's in the neurological circles, it's known that we are an emotional machine that thinks. Isn't that a big shift? And it makes sense. So with our kids with ADHD who have sometimes very intense emotions and difficulty seeing the little picture and the big picture anyway, it can be a really tough life to be living. So the brain is a con man. In addition, when something hits us as unusual, so we're going down the freeway and we're not noticing all the cars going by really fast. We're used to that expected phenomenon. Now, if it had been our first time on the freeway, what would we be noticing? The cars going by really quickly, right? I mean, that would be scary if you'd never been on a freeway before. But we're pretty much used to that. But if a car veers across 3 lanes in front of us, what happens? Our adrenaline goes up and our emotional brain engages. And we go into what? What are the F's? Fight, flight, and freeze. So usually we flight on the freeway and we veer away. We don't say, that pisses me off, and crash into the car that's veering across the lanes. So we have a good reaction to that, and that's the importance of our emotional brain, is to be able to react very quickly like that. But most of life is not about tigers chasing us down, and most of our life is more rational than that, but still, it's our limbic system, it's our emotional system that responds first. Did you know that our brain, well, let me ask you, who knows how much of our caloric intake goes to our brain? %20 of our caloric intake goes to our brain. Why? Because our brain uses a lot of energy in order to keep it running. It's got, its battery pack requires a lot. So when our kids come home from school, often their battery pack is pretty empty, right? Would you agree? And they tend to come home and they're sensitive, more sensitive than usual. They're more anxious. If their meds are wearing off, watch out. So I'm going to be talking a little bit later about homework and things that can help with homework. The brain, as I was saying, sets the priorities by going through the emotional system. And attention is like a flashlight in the dark in our brain. So the flashlight is looking for what to prioritize, what to pay attention to, because there's too much for the brain to pay attention to everything. The brain doesn't have a forever bandwidth, right? I can't pay attention to all of you, and how many lights are in the room, and the color of the walls, and how many tables there are, and whether these lights are on or not on. I can't pay attention to all that and still talk to you. So our brain picks and chooses and prioritizes what to pay attention to. And that flashlight is determined by what? Where it goes. It's determined by our emotions. So students in general do better with a classroom where they're not feeling anxious, and they do better in a classroom where they're not bored, so that their flashlight can go and find what it is they're supposed to be paying attention to. And if they're anxious, the flashlight goes where? To what's making them anxious. And that hijacks the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, and makes it very, very difficult for them to pay attention to the teacher, pay attention to the conversation, and even hear the directions for homework. So emotions govern a whole lot of what happens for students, and particularly students with ADHD that are often having trouble tracking in the classroom already. because their flashlight kind of wanders to other things that are sparklier. So if the classroom is boring, that flashlight goes to something that is more interesting, or they create something that's more interesting, like making a little pea shooter and shooting it and seeing a reaction from somebody, because that wakes up their brain. We all know how almost painful it is to be sitting in, say, an auditorium where you're in the middle of the aisle and you can't get out, and the performance is so boring that you can hardly keep your eyes open. How many of you have had that experience? Yeah, I see nods and hands. It's most of you. And that ability to stay awake when we're bored, well, it's not a very strong ability. And with ADHD, boredom tolerance is already low. So they're in the classroom, and if they start to get bored and they start to get sleepy, what do they want to do? They want to wake up. Just like we want to get in that theater, we want to get up and step over all those people and go out and wake ourselves up, because that sensation of falling asleep when you're trying to be awake, it's, as I said, it's really painful. It's not just rude, it's also painful. So when our kids start to get bored, they'll do something to wake themselves up. So they'll daydream, they'll look around and find something more interesting, they'll create something that's interesting, like I said, the pea shooter, or knocking the chair in front of them, and anything to make life a little bit more interesting so that their brain wakes up. How many of you have seen that phenomenon in kids? Yeah. Can you think of an example of it? What do you see them do?
I've had a kid who starts bugging the kids around him.
Yeah, starts bugging the kids around him. And she's using her hands, bugging the kids around them. So the hands start moving. Yes, yes. Anything else? Any other examples? Pacing, yeah. Pacing, getting up and pacing. And in fact, that can be an accommodation for a kid to be able to pace at the back of the room where they're hopefully not bothering anybody, but they need to wake up their brain. So providing something in the classroom where they can legitimately wake up their brain is a really good thing for those kids. So, I want to go back over something that I was saying and go back over it in a little different way. Our emotional brain, the amygdala will push the accelerator, right? So something happens, the car veers in front of you, phew, the emotional brain turns on, and then eventually it gets to the prefrontal cortex. So when do we start thinking when we've got that unexpected experience of a car moving across the lanes in front of us? When do we start to think? When we're calmer, yeah. Once the emergency is over. So, and then we begin to think. And it takes 26 hours for the cortisol to get out of our system. 26 hours. That's a really long time, isn't it? Now that can be modulated down to a fifth of the time if we have mindfulness practices that can calm ourselves down. Isn't that cool? But still, a fifth of the time is still over 5 hours. So you've got a kid who walked into school and somebody pushed him, shoved him. It happens every day. Same kid, push the kid again. And what happens? At least 5 hours of a higher level of cortisol. So you know how it is if you get a really close call on the freeway, you almost got hit, you go home and you talk about it, right? It's like it's still in your brain for a period of time and you're still processing it. Well, our kids often have the experience of needing to process too many things to be able to process them all. I want to emphasize that all of our brains are geared towards the negative more than the positive. And why would that be? Well, because in our early days as humans, we really needed to notice the dangers more than the beauty of the trees. So you sit and reflect on and meditate on the beauty of the trees, a tiger could come along and eat you. So the negative is more salient to our brains naturally in order to protect us. Now with ADHD, we know that sensitivity is even higher. And something like 85% of adults who had not been diagnosed until adulthood thought that their lives were hopeless until that diagnosis, 85%. And part of that is the negative spin on our brains naturally, and then the enhanced negative spin that comes with ADHD, and then the greasy buildup of not being diagnosed and that person not understanding why they were having the troubles that they were having. If you're in a wheelchair, you know why you're having the troubles getting around, right? And you get help with accommodations, and people are sympathetic, and people aren't ribbing you, why can't you get over here quicker? But with ADHD, it's an invisible disability, and so people get, kids and people get a lot of negative feedback loops, and if they don't understand that they have an invisible disability that impairs them, and that people have reactions to it because they don't understand it, then that person feels frequently, what's wrong with me, in a way that is very negative, and it enhances that self-talk that leads to that hopelessness that the statistics show us occurs in the adults that hadn't been diagnosed earlier. I really like this about the negativity. This really shows us, if you've got a bowl of cherries and you find a single cockroach in it, what happens to your interest in that bowl of cherries? Gone. But if you have a bowl of cockroaches and there's a cherry in it, does that make the cockroaches any more interesting to you? Now, so the positivity of a single cherry does not make you like those cockroaches anymore, but one cockroach can ruin the appeal of the cherries. Right? We've all had something akin, parallel to that experience. So that's how our brains filter. They tend to filter in the negative and filter out the positive. And it's survival, but it really leads to the con man quality of our brains. So one of the things that's really important to do with kids with ADHD is to help them understand their brains, the nature of the brain in general, but then their brains on ADHD, and how the thoughts that they have sometimes are governed by the adrenaline of the emotion, and that those thoughts, as somebody had said earlier, are sometimes irrational, and that making choices based on those irrational thoughts doesn't lead to a productive life. So teaching children about their brains teaching them the neurology of their brains, teaching them the neurology of learning, that you can't learn if you're anxious, you can't learn if you're bored, and that you need to find tools to calm down your anxiety and to increase your interest. We know, the research is really, really clear, that children, and we know it as adults, that children who are not interested in what's being presented or the manner in which it's presented are going to get bored. And if they're bored, they're not inputting what it is that's being said. So emotional salience is a really important quality for a teacher to have and to have in the classroom. So that's, again, the priority of we are an emotional machine that thinks rather than a thinking machine that's emotional. And so the emotionality of the classroom and the students needs to be addressed. And many teachers really understand their content very, very well, but they don't know how to get it emotionally salient for their students. And that is not taught the way it should be taught in schools. I think Jen probably knows that. That it's an area of education of teachers that really needs to be developed. And the same thing for parents and for us as professionals, is that if we don't have a child's interest, then the boredom will set in and they're not hearing anything that we're saying. So the topic has to be relevant to them or interesting to them or presented in a manner where there's some unexpected qualities, where you've got, you know, the positive experience of, instead of the car sliding across the freeway, the positive experience of all of a sudden you're on a merry-go-round ride or you're on a roller coaster, intellectually, you know, some sort of parallel that surprises them and gets their interest going. So I talked about earlier that anxiety, even when the threat is gone, that our minds perpetuate it, you know, the 26 hours that it takes for the cortisol to get out of our system. And anxiety is about poor predictions and avoidance. And what do I mean by that, by these two things? So if we've gone on the freeway and let's say that car slid across the 3 lanes and hit us, what's the tendency of we humans the next time we need to get on the freeway? We tend to avoid. And why is it? Because our brain doesn't register. We've been on the freeway thousands and thousands and thousands of times and we haven't been hit. But we've been hit once. It triggered cortisol, and the emotional brain trumps the rational brain, and therefore we predict what? It's going to happen again. Is it likely to happen again? No, it's actually not. But that's what our students experience. Something bad happens, they raise their hand, and a teacher humiliates them, accidentally or on purpose, because their answer was really off topic. And the student thought that it was totally on topic because they weren't following what the teacher was saying. How likely are they to raise their hand again? Not very likely, because they predict it's going to happen again. Now with that teacher, that might be an accurate prediction, but it might not be. So avoidance kicks in. Avoidance is a killer in learning. If you avoid, you can't learn. So again, teaching students about how their brain works, and that if they get a negative experience, that their brain is going to tend to predict that negative experience is going to happen again. So I wrote a paper, I turned it in, I got a bad grade. Why write another paper? Rather than failure is an opportunity for learning. In order to learn, we all have to fail. And think about when you learned to ride a bike. If you hadn't failed, you wouldn't have learned how to keep your balance. So failure is an essential part of learning, but in our culture we tend to put down failure, and so students get the idea that they're wrong and bad if they couldn't do something, especially if the rest of the class has moved on and they can do it, and our student can't yet do it, then the sense of I'm a failure, and what kicks in is anxiety, and then prediction, or sometimes the other way around, and then avoidance. So again, one way to deal with all of this is teaching a child about their brain and how their brain can be a con man and fool them. And do they want to be fooled by their brain, or do they want to be in charge of what they're going to do with what their brain tells them? And another approach is the mindfulness practices, which teaching them, how to calm themselves down once they've been triggered is a really important thing for them to understand. And setting up accommodations in schools so that children can do what it is that they need to do to calm themselves down, whether it's to go to a special room or a special beanbag chair where they can take time to settle down, or whether it's to go to some chosen person on the school site where they feel safe and they can hang out for 5 minutes and then go back to the classroom. It's really essential for them to have some way to deal with that anxiety so that it goes down. And we need to teach those things. We need to teach self-advocacy to students about how to deal with their anxiety so that they know that they have options and they're not trapped. I mean, think about the times that you have been anxious and you have felt trapped. I mean, whether it's in an MRI machine or a relationship, and especially if it's ongoing stress, it's a really difficult thing to combat. So, you know, it's really important to remember that our kids are doing the best that they can, and that they've learned, you know, as they grow up, they learn ways of coping that are maladaptive, that don't serve them in the long run, but give them immediate relief. And the healthy ways of coping that we want to teach them do not give them immediate relief. Avoidance gives them immediate relief. And so, again, it's important to teach them that there is this timeline and that it's understandable that they want to cope immediately to get their anxiety down, but that ends up not calming them down in the long haul. And when you've got kids with ADHD, you've got the 2 time settings. Now and not now. So it's especially hard for our kids with ADHD to think about, you know, if I don't do my homework today, I'm going to be upset about it tomorrow. It's today I feel stressed, today it's overwhelming, right at this moment I don't want to do it, and I need to go to the bathroom immediately. And they need something that they can do to help calm themselves down in that moment, and understanding how their brain works is one way to help them. And then having those tools that I just talked about is another way of helping them, so that they can get through and be able to prioritize the not now. So homework. How many of you deal with homework wars? Just one of you? 2 of you? No? Okay. I'm going to go through this a little bit. How many of you know about executive functions? Okay. Most of you know about executive functions? A little bit? A little bit. So executive functions are those skills in our brain, that set of being able to organize our to where focus is going to be, to put in effort, to from one activity to another. It's like the CEO of a company or the conductor of a symphony, where you can have other parts of the brain working just fine, but if you don't have somebody governing the interaction, all hell breaks loose. And that symphony sounds pretty crappy if you don't have a conductor. Well, the executive functions are part of what conducts the other parts of the brain, some of which are in ADHD are going to work really, really well. So you may have a kid that's excellent at basketball, but in the classroom when you're studying science, taking a ball, throwing it against the wall is not what they're supposed to be doing, right? So choosing where you're going to put your attention, being able to initiate when it's time to do something that is, for example, boring or anxiety producing, and being able to initiate anyway is part of executive functioning. And in ADHD, executive functioning is almost always impaired. So guess where the executive functioning aspects of the brain are? In the prefrontal cortex. So remember, what happens when we get sensory input, including talk? It goes to our emotional brain first, and if it gets waylaid there with anxiety, it doesn't get to our prefrontal cortex. So we've got impaired functioning in the executive functions in the prefrontal cortex, and we've got a kid or an adult who is more easily aroused emotionally and has trouble escaping that arousal, and we want them to sit and be rational and to work on their homework. It's hard for them if they've had a day of stress at school. They've come home, they may be tired, they may be anxious from school, and you can get the resistance pretty intensely. Sometimes not doing the homework isn't about the homework itself. You can have that, like I said, the emotional gas tank is empty, the fuel has run out. And remember what I said about that our brains take 20% of our calories to function. And kids with ADHD really have to overwork. If they're conscientious, they have to overwork in order to work at school. So they have literally exhausted their brain. And they may need a snack. They may need a break. They may need to run around. The problem is, how do you set a time for when they transition back to their homework? And sometimes that's difficult because transitions are often not easy for kids with ADHD. It's an executive function. And doing all those other things are more salient than sitting down and doing the homework. So it's important to come up with a plan with your kid, and even put it in writing about when makes sense, and to coordinate, to have a conversation with them about when it makes sense to do their homework, and how long they'll do their homework, and where they'll do their homework, and whether or not they want help. So on your part, do your kids know what your expectations are, or if you're working with kids like the two of you are, and Jen, do the kids that you're working with know your expectations about their schoolwork? Are they clear about what you think should happen in sitting down together, or when they sit down to do their work? And those expectations need to be explicit for those kids. It may be that the homework load is more than really they have time for, and that has to be in the equation of the conversation that you have about the homework load, and that their brain can't wrap around that full homework load and what's going to go by the wayside, and have an agreement about that. It can make a big difference if you're sitting with your child. How many know about the body double? A little bit? So the body double is this phenomenon that adults with ADHD have discovered, that if somebody's sitting with them, their brain works better to concentrate on tasks that are boring. So doing taxes, having a friend come over and work on some project of theirs, just sitting at the table, means that the bored brain of ADHD can focus a little bit better on doing those taxes. It means that a kid with ADHD that is struggling to focus, and they're up and down, up and down, up and down, may do better if you're sitting there going over paying your bills. Just simply having another adult there can help the child focus. I had a client, an MD, who thought he cheated through college because he was barely getting by his freshman, sophomore year. And his junior year, his roommate went to the library every night and he got good grades. So he followed his roommate to the library, figured out how he got good grades, and sat there next to his roommate and did his homework. He saw, how his roommate organized his papers, and he borrowed that template to organize his papers, and he ended up in med school. And even as a very successful physician, he still thought that he had cheated in school. And I told him that these days we actually give kids templates about how to write, and that he had on his own had figured out the template of his roommate. But he found that it was so much easier to concentrate if he just went to the library with his roommate. If he went to the library alone, he was up looking at the books, wandering the aisles looking at the books, and he was perplexed about why he couldn't, if his roommate wasn't there, focus, but if his roommate was there, he could. So that's the body double phenomenon. So with your kids, ask them how much help they want from you, and want the help. Make sure that they know your schedule. And how long do they want you to sit with them? Do they want you just to sit there, or do they want to be able to ask you questions? Do they want you to go over their work with them? Some kids just simply want you to be there, and they want to turn in their work as is. And that can be really important, because the teacher then gets the feedback about what they can do without you looking over their work. Let's see, homework. You know, one of the things that's important to talk about with your kids is your limitations. So if you can't sit for 2 or 3 hours or 4 hours with them on homework, you compromise. You let them know this is when I'm available, or this is what I'm willing to do. And you can come up with a list of things that they need to do before you help them. So you may want them to try it independently. You may want them to ask you rather than you offering. You know, Mom, I'm ready for your help. You may want them to ask you politely, I can't do this. Rather for them to say, I need your help. You may want to give them a second chance if they get into that emotional brain place and say, can you try that again? And you may want them to be clear about what it is that they want help on rather than just come help me, which comes out of the anxiety place. So going back to anxiety, it's really important that we, as parents or as professionals working with kids, that we keep ourselves calm. And sometimes that's hard to do when you've got a kid that's in avoidance and who's resisting, and a kid that maybe is getting even provocative, to keep our calm. So that's where we don't want our emotional brain to take over our rational brain. And it happens, and so then you have to have some way to deal with it, such as getting a break, saying, I'm getting worked up, I'm going to go take a break and I'll be back in 5 minutes. So you model for your child or your student that it happens that we get emotionally overloaded, and we need to get that overload down in order to think clearly. So that concept of anxious brains can't learn, anxious brains can't cooperate, anxious brains don't have empathy, right? And you want your kids to understand that, and that it's not that they're wrong and bad to get anxious. They can work on ways not to get anxious, but they can work even more so on ways to get that anxiety down once it gets triggered. How many of you are utilizing mindfulness practices at home or in your practice? Okay, good. Mark Burton is a pediatrician in New York. His mother ran a school for students with LDs for, 30 years or something. And Mark Burton wrote a book called Mindfulness in the Teen Brain that you might want to take a look at, because what the research shows is that a little bit of mindfulness practices can change the brain in terms of its ability to focus, in terms of its ability to choose where to focus. And the big deal with the mindfulness practices is that it helps students and us, anybody, to be able to identify the emotions that are going on in their body as almost separate from them, so they can name them. And what the research shows is the ability to name our emotions actually helps in the emotions calming down. Just simply being able to name it. I'm angry. I'm hurt. I'm scared. I'm anxious. Simply being able to name it. Isn't that phenomenal? And research shows that 1/3 of adults do not have the ability to name their emotions. 1/3, 1/3. And yet only 1/3 can name their emotions. Sorry, I said that wrong. Only 1/3 can name their emotions. So 2/3 can't. And given the research that calms us down, that's a really essential ingredient to have. And teaching teens about mindfulness practices means they're going to get better at being able to identify emotions. What we know is that mindful practices increase the ability to identify emotion and to be less reactive to it. It's like going back to the brain being a con man. Mindfulness practices help us to see that the thoughts that we're having about the emotion are simply thoughts about the emotion and aren't necessarily true. And so that's where we can let those thoughts float by like on a cloud, or we can be with and name that emotion almost as if it's separate from us. so we're not so absorbed and run by the emotions and the thoughts. How many of you are using apps with your kids, or use apps yourself, mindfulness apps? Okay, and what have you found to be useful? Yeah, which app? Insight Timer?
Yes, that's it.
Ah, 2 people, Insight Timer. Yep, it's on my list of ones that are good. Headspace, and there are so many out there, but it's helpful to find ones that people have found work for kids. Simply being, and these work for adults too. And you can go on YouTube and find music, mindfulness music, that can be background music in your house for when your kid comes home or when you've had a tough day and you're not so calm. And the music and the use of apps have been scientifically found to be useful for calming down the emotions.
Is it like the music that's playing in a spa or yoga class?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to move to the question of how many of you have had the feedback, just let him or her fail, and then they'll do better. I've had that experience with my son. He just needs to fail, and then that'll motivate him. Well, how many times can a kid fail and pick themselves up and dust themselves off? And our kids with ADHD don't tend to learn from mistakes. And if they're not understanding, for example, the homework accurately, then they can't do their homework. Or if they have a memory issue and they haven't been taught how to deal with that, they can do their homework and not turn it in. How many of you have seen kids that have done their homework and then they don't turn it in? Yeah, all of you. Yeah. It's a phenomenon, isn't it? And it really says something about the fact that they don't turn it in. There's now and not now. The homework's done, it's done. Check that off the list. Mind mapping for starting writing can get a kid going that is stuck. So can simply just taking a pencil, preferably because there's drag and it registers to the brain. The brain can feel the drag of a pencil, and just simply start making movements on a piece of paper can open up the brain to get past that anxiety, that block, and start to write. And how many of you have used mind mapping? Okay, I really encourage you to go online and look at mind mapping for your ADHD student and for you. So, one of the things that isn't usually taught in school are study skills. And if you're thinking about your kid going off to college, they really need to have those study skills under their belt, and they need to be taught explicitly. Many kids pick it up as kind of the hidden curriculum, how to study. My client who became a doctor, picked up how to study by watching his roommate study. That's really unusual. Most folks with ADHD need to be taught exactly how to do it. They need templates. So study skills. If your school has staff that can teach study skills explicitly, that's a really important thing to get for your student. If not, then to go to an educational therapist and who can teach study skills to your student is going to help that student for years.
Holly, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
In your experience with clients, have you seen particular study skills be more key for ADHD students than others? Because it's a pretty broad
Yeah.
category.
Broad category. So question is, have I seen particular study skills be more important and more effective for the student to teach them those study skills? I think that the executive functioning aspects are key and workarounds for that, as well as teaching memory, how to remember, because we know that drill and kill, research has shown drill and kill does not work for memory. Drill, 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 drill. It works short term, but it doesn't really work long term. And so we know, helping students understand what doesn't work. And simple things like, that studying something before you go to sleep at night, that your brain consolidates it better than studying it in the morning. So there's some, scientific pieces that you can teach them and that are part of learning how their brain works, which is part of learning study skills. How to calm themselves down, I think, is a really important sidebar of study skills. I think this is really, really important. Don't let your relationship suffer on the altar of homework. You're going to be in your kid's life for a very, very long time, and relatedness and having an adult that believes in that kid is, we find in the trajectory of life, that if a kid has one adult that believes in them, that doesn't mean that you agree with everything they do or don't do, but you believe in them as a human being, that bodes for more success over the course of lifetime than turning in your homework. Isn't that amazing? Relatedness. Relationships trump. I'm going to read you something. This is one aspect of mindfulness practices. It's called a pause. A pause is a possibility. It can inspire. It can open a window to the present moment. It can interrupt an old habit. It can prevent a violent word or violent action. It can create anticipation. That's an important one, because our kids with ADHD, if you do the unexpected and you put in a pause longer than usual, sometimes their head will pop up, because they'll sense that's unexpected. The unexpected tends to get our attention, just like that car veering across the freeway is more likely to get our attention than all those cars right next to us going so fast. It allows thoughts to come and to go. It can remind us of who we are and who that person is right in front of us. It can stop the action. It can allow everyone else to catch up. It can change the direction of a day and of a lifetime. It can restore sanity. So that's when our brains get caught up in emotionality, and it's trumped our rational mind, that a pause can help our rational mind, our prefrontal cortex, start functioning again as the emotional brain calms down. So along those lines, I'd like us to take a pause, but a particular kind of pause. One of the things it says here is it can remind us of who we are and who that person is right in front of us. So imagine you're working with either your student or your child, or a student that you're working with, somebody who's been frustrating to you, an incident that's been frustrating, and then remember that child at a time where where you felt close to them. Maybe they made you laugh, or you said something and they laughed, or they were in a soft place, a receptive place where the relationship and the relatedness felt alive. Get a picture of that child, what they look like, what the feel is for you with the child. And we're just going to take about 3 seconds. You can close your eyes or keep them open, whichever way you want. Okay, that couple second pause, where did you go? What was that like? Anybody want to say anything about it?
Try to stay in kind of a positive place.
What's that?
Try to stay in a positive place.
Try to stay in a positive place. Mhm. Yeah, the pause can help us try to stay in a positive place. Yeah. Did anybody have emotions change while you were in that couple of seconds? Yeah, what changed?
I think I was feeling overwhelmed thinking about this particular student and situation, and I just felt much calmer.
Okay, went from overwhelm about a particular student she's working with to then feeling calmer. In a couple of seconds. Can you imagine if we practice that, several times a day, every day? That's a mindfulness practice that is so easy and so simple to use. And the reality that what we pay attention to grows, that if we pay attention to, and it's easier, remember our brains naturally go in the direction of the negative rather than the positive. So if our child is irritating us, their behavior, or student, when that student or child is coming home or coming to your office and walking in your door, that anticipatory place tends to be negative rather than positive. And so just taking a few seconds to remind yourself of a good moment with that child so that you get into a positive place. So that if they do walk in and they're grumpy or irritable and irritating, or they're in avoidance, that I don't want to place, that you're in a calmer place to be able to interact with them and to be able to hold the reality of the negative space that they're in and it not be contagious to you. So there's, does anybody know about Seerly? Seerly. Nobody's heard about that? Seerly is a company that came out of a neurologist at UCSF. Developed this company. And I'm not going to talk in detail about it, but you can follow up and get a hold of them at neuroscapeucsf.com. A neurologist was curious about how gaming might support cognition because of the neuroplasticity of the brain, and whether enhancing cognition might help with some of the deficits of ADHD. Now, this is the opposite of addressing the emotional end, right? I mean, I've been talking almost primarily about dealing with emotions and ADHD and the difference that that can make. Well, this is a totally different approach. And the gaming, it's not the usual kind of gaming. It's gaming that's closed loop gaming where it adjusts to where you are. And it stimulates, they believe, stimulates particular parts of the brain. And they've found the results so far, they're looking at PTSD, depression, MS, ADHD, traumatic brain injury, and Alzheimer's. And they're using whole body engagement with the gaming to see if it stimulates new neural pathways in the brain. And they want to use this, if it's effective, they want to use it as a diagnostic and therapeutic tool. And they were looking for research subjects. So if you know of somebody who might be interested, their marketing is that this is going to be the first non-medication treatment of ADHD that the FDA will approve. That's their hope and that's their prediction. So UCSF, anybody want the name of the doctor who started it? Okay.
Could you say, so they're looking at games that improve cognition? What was that? I didn't really follow the actual link you're saying. They're hoping that cognition games or improving
So say it again.
We're hoping that the games that can improve cognition will help with ADHD.
Yeah, no, they're actually developing games that they think specifically, use the whole body, that they think specifically work on the ability to have more cognitive flexibility and to develop the cognitive skills. So that would include the executive functions. Yeah, yeah. So he's an MD and a PhD, a neurologist. How many of you want to know about the law and ADHD? Yeah, okay. So can I erase this? Okay, so we have, for special ed, we have the 504 plan and we have IDEA. And the 504 plans came out of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And where that got developed was after the movement in the streets about blacks and discrimination, and other groups, other populations, realized that they'd been discriminated against too. And one of the arenas was education of students with disabilities. And that the terms used is that they'd been warehoused in schools and ignored and punished and not served, and that they hadn't received education. So there was, in 1973, under the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, the 504 plan was invented, and it took until 1977 for it to be implemented. A law can be made, but if you don't have regulations on how to enforce that law, the law is no good. And it took until 1977 for the regulations to be developed. And it took a sit-in, 28-day sit-in at the UN Plaza to get this going. Isn't that incredible? 28-day sit-in. One of the things about 504 plans that is really misunderstood is that parents are often told, schools misunderstand it too, that a 504 plan is only accommodations. How many of you have heard that? Yeah. Well, it's not. 504 plan requires a student to be given FAPE. You know what FAPE is? It's a legal term. A free and appropriate public education, FAPE. So FAPE is a requirement of the special ed laws, that students have to have FAPE, free and appropriate public education. And so students that are under 504 plans, let me erase that for now, under 504 plans often require services in order to get FAPE. So whatever will provide FAPE is required under the 504 plan. So students can get services. They can get psychotherapy. They can get study skills training. Legally, they can get these things. Getting them is a whole nother ball of wax. IDEA came under the laws, came under the Department of Education. And that was in 1975. So IDEA said, again, that students with disabilities are guaranteed a free and appropriate public education. And schools know that that includes accommodations and services that are required in order for that student to get a free, appropriate public education. Initial law, was the Rowley case, said that there had to be some progress made in order for FAPE to have been gotten by a student. And in Sonoma County, there was a case where a student in a year learned 3 new words in reading. And the hearing officer deemed that progress. It was in the right direction, therefore that student had gotten FAPE because he learned to read 3 new words. And the parents lost the case.
How does that meet appropriate?
Yeah. Well, here's the good news. The new language just recently is, so the old language was some benefit must be provided. Now the education program must be appropriately ambitious in light of his circumstances. Whew. That's a better definition, a more, as you said, Jen, a more appropriate definition, and it really helps our students with ADHD, whose IQ is often just fine, but their production is impaired, and they often are getting by in school, but just getting by. And for our students who are twice exceptional, 2E, twice exceptional, where they have giftedness and they have learning disabilities, because often those students are, getting their C's, but they're not adequately stimulated and they're not living up to their potential at all. And so, this appropriately ambitious in light of his circumstances is really going to help those students. So this is going to have to be advocated for, though, in the schools. Parents and advocates are going to have to know about this new definition, new interpretation, and be able to go to bat for a student in an IEP meeting.
When was that language changed?
Just recently. Yeah, I think it's within this last year. So also new, and you probably know this, the current administration wants to roll back the regulations and interpretations, and has rolled back some of the interpretations and regulations. The laws still stand, but the interpretations that benefited students have been deleted. Many of them have been deleted. What hasn't been deleted is a letter that was written, let me find it, recently, 2016, the U.S. Department of Education issued and disseminated to all the special ed directors across the country in public schools a Dear Colleague letter from the Office of Civil Rights. And that's an important letter to read. There's a lot of detail in it. So the Dear Colleague letter, so you want it, Dear Colleague, and you want to look for ADHD 2016. If you Google that, you'll eventually find that letter. So one of the things that this letter says, and remember this came from the U.S. Department of Education to all the special ed directors, they should have read it, is that extra help, tutoring, or unusual effort on the part of the student are not a basis for excluding a student from special ed services. So I've worked with families where they have in place all these supports of tutoring, educational therapy, and the kid is Monday through Friday doing homework, Saturday and Sunday doing homework, they're getting their homework in, and they don't have a life. And they're passing. And the school says they don't qualify. Well, this says they can qualify. They need to have some other things going on in order to qualify, but the fact that they're passing based on effort, that they're passing based on extra help or support or tutoring, and that they look fine on paper doesn't mean that what's going on outside school isn't considered. That has to be considered and taken into consideration. So that's 2016. It's a really important letter. Now, it's not the same as law. Law is more powerful, and a school district could argue and take it to court and say, this interpretation, the Dear Colleague letter, isn't right. They'd have to take it to court. Again, research has shown that a letter of a personal nature, your own experience with ADHD or special ed or learning disabilities to your legislator is more important than a petition with 10,000 signatures. That they're more likely to pay attention to something that is a case, that is a situation, that has emotion, that has real people in it, than a petition. So one of the things, given the political climate that we're in, that we need to be doing is joining organizations that fight for the rights of students with learning disabilities. So CHAD, LDA, and there are others. Those two organizations work really hard with their advocacy. In fact, CHAD, the Professional Political Action Committee, was key in writing that Dear Colleague letter. And not only did they mostly write that Dear Colleague letter, they sent it out to all kinds of nonprofits who signed on to it. And that's how it got to the Department of Education's attention, is there were so many nonprofits signed on to it, and that's how the Department of Education decided to disseminate it. And it was Chad who spearheaded it and did, a lot of the work for it.
So the Department of Education didn't even write it?
No.
They wrote it in.
Right. So political advocacy is really, really important in order to keep the protections for our students, in order to have more protections. So write, call, email your legislators, write letters to the editor, educate families around you, your neighbors, your employers, and even consider getting on government committees that make decisions. So I'm going to go back with the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that came out in 1975. There were, as I said, there have been interpretations over the years of what that law means. Something else that has come out of case law is that students with depression or anxiety have often been ignored in the special ed system. But remember, if you're anxious, you can't learn. So it impairs a important aspect of life, so it qualifies under 504 if it's impairing their learning. And students with depression and anxiety can qualify under other health impaired for an IEP. And why under other health impaired? Because depression and anxiety are neurologically based disorders. They're medical disorders. So other health impaired, OHI. There's 13 gates that you can go through to get an IEP, and one of them is learning disabilities, and there has to be a discrepancy between your ability and your performance. And so that's a little harder to get through at times, but there's no discrepancy that is needed for OHI. You just have to have a medical condition that interferes with some aspect of life. And for an IEP, it has to interfere with learning in some way. Anxiety interferes with learning. So what kinds of services can a student get? Well, case law shows they can get counseling for their anxiety and depression. Some schools have counselors, many don't. So as a parent or as an advocate, you can ask for the school to pay for counseling outside the campus because it's a support that the kids need in order to learn. One of the things that sometimes happens in IEP meetings is this phenomenon I was talking about in terms of the effort that parents and students put in, and that's the outside of school life. Same thing happens with outside of school life in terms of avoidance. So we have kids that will participate at school, who will contain their anxiety, and who will say yes to sitting and doing their work, and then when they come home, they say no. Right? Yeah, you're nodding. You know that phenomenon. And I mean, one thing, if they're on medication, their medication's wearing off. The other is they're done. You know, at the end of the school day, they really don't want to be doing anymore and don't want to feel that stress and anxiety. And the other is they feel safer at home to show, you know, how stressed they are. And it can come out, it can be pretty ugly. So one of the things that parents can do is to make a log of, well, one, you can make a log of the homework that's being done at home and how long it takes, because you're dealing with avoidance. The other is you can make a log of behaviors. You can even make a videotape of your child falling apart. And you can take that to the IEP meeting, and that now has been interpreted, and parents have believed it for a long time, but that, you know, you have to have data for the IEP, that those logs are now considered data. So, you know, the teachers will bring data about, well, the student did this homework this assignment and that assignment, and they don't cause trouble in class, and, you know, they don't appear anxious in school, and they have their data. Well, now the parents' data at home counts, but it needs to be in a really organized form, you know, where you track it every day, like for a week or a month. And that will help get a kid services that is needing services. Methodology. How many of you have dealt with methodology issues at school? Okay, so you know, methodology is not usually something that parents can request. Well, it turns out that the interpretation now is unless the student needs a particular methodology. So if they need multisensory language arts, then and that's not being provided for your student that has a reading disability, then you can request a methodology that is peer approved, research driven, and that can be requested. It used to be parents could not request any methodology. Now, if there's an equally research-based, research-validated, peer-reviewed methodology, then the school can pick that other one as long as it's equivalent. So, but if they don't have something equivalent, the parent can say, we want this methodology and the school needs to provide it. That's new and really, really important. You know, regrettably, executive functioning deficits education doesn't yet have a research-validated methodology, so it's such an essential thing to request from schools, but it's often a very watered-down, you know, organize your backpack approach to executive functioning deficits, and our students need much more than that. So keep your eyes out, because at some point there will be research-validated methodology around executive functions, and that's going to make a big difference for our students. How many of you know about sluggish cognitive tempo? Okay. This is a really interesting, I think, a really interesting piece of what came out of long-term research in the conference. So sluggish cognitive tempo is not in the DSM, the diagnostic manual, but it's got a history that's pretty important. Sluggish cognitive tempo. So that's your student or child who is a dreamer, who physically is sluggish and slow, who is slow to warm up, slow to process, slow to initiate, slow to absorb what's going on. Their IQs tend to be just fine. It's not an IQ problem. They can get confused. They're often sleepy, and they're highly error prone. And I said it a different way, but they're slower at responding to a stimulus, slower to orient, and they give less attention to important tasks. These kids used to be diagnosed, and they still are, misdiagnosed as ADHD inattentive type because they present in a way that looks very similar to ADHD attentive type. One of the things that's different is that slower to respond to a stimulus. ADHD, it's variable on their response to a stimulus. They can respond very quickly sometimes and very slowly sometimes, depending on their interest and the environment. Whereas with sluggish cognitive tempo, it's a chronic condition of being slower to respond. They don't have sluggish cognitive tempo, the impulse control issues. It's not an inhibition disorder like ADHD. ADHD, it's hard to inhibit. It's hard to filter, input coming in. It's hard to filter and decide what I'm going to do with my behavior. It's hard to filter and decide what I'm going to pay attention to. And that's ADHD. And that's not an issue at all with sluggish cognitive tempo. And there's no executive functioning deficits with sluggish cognitive tempo. However, when you get sluggish cognitive tempo co-occurring with ADHD, you get worse executive functioning deficits than any of the types of ADHD. So we don't know why sluggish cognitive tempo exacerbates the executive functioning deficits when on its own there aren't any executive functioning deficits, but it does. It's estimated that 4 to 5% of the population have sluggish cognitive tempo. And as I said, they're usually diagnosed as having ADHD inattentive type. And one of the problems is that the stimulant medications not only don't work, they can sometimes cause problems for these kids. Atomoxetine, Strattera, has been found to be sometimes helpful with these kids and adults. So it's an adult disorder as well as a kid disorder. And in fact, over the life trajectory, it can become worse in adulthood or more impairing in adulthood. I don't know that the symptoms are worse, but the difficulty with living life becomes harder. These are, as kids, they tend to have more trouble in math than reading. And, when I said about they make more errors, they'll do things like a math problem they will see as, a subtraction problem they'll see as a division problem. Just a quote, silly error. But these are the kinds of errors that they make where they just missee certain things. Socially, they tend to be withdrawn and passive, isolated. They don't tend to initiate very easily, and they tend to be anxious. They're not rejected socially, but they're more overlooked. ADHD kids tend to be rejected. They do have more friends than students with ADHD, but it's a fewer group of friends than the norm. It does not co-occur with OCD or conduct disorder. OCD. ODD, oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. In fact, it's the opposite. Kids with sluggish cognitive tempo tend to be very punishment sensitive, so they work very, very hard not to be oppositional and not to get into trouble. Anxiety and depression are common. It's not linked with bipolar disorder, whereas with ADHD is highly linked with bipolar disorder.
Highly linked with bipolar?
Highly linked. Highly linked. There tends to be hypersomnia, sleeping a lot, and it's almost as inheritable as ADHD. ADHD is almost as inheritable as height, And sluggish cognitive tempo is almost as inheritable as ADHD. So if you find a child that is diagnosed with sluggish cognitive tempo, there's somebody in the family tree likely to also have that challenge. One of the names that was considered changing it to is pathological mind wandering. Pathological mind wandering. It's a phenomenon that has been seen on brain scans with these kids and the adults, that their mind, the pathology is not meant to be pathologizing the child or adult, but that the mind is pathologically mind wandering. The mind just wanders and wanders and wanders and wanders and doesn't settle. It's different than a busy mind, but it has some similarities. And if you're interested, we have one person that I know of. Spelling that wrong. Nope, that's right. Linda Pfeiffer at UCSF has some knowledge about sluggish cognitive tempo. Hardly anybody does. So it's not ADHD, but it's misdiagnosed as ADHD inattentive type. It needs behavioral supports, or what works more than stimulant medication, clearly better than stimulant medication. And the lifetime trajectory is pretty sad, and so intervention is really important. The behavioral supports that Linda Pfeiffer talks about are really important. Can somebody tell me the time? 10:30? Okay, perfect. Let's do some Q&A. I've got charts that I forgot to pass around that are ADHD and co-occurring conditions, and the occurrence of co-occurring conditions. So nearly 75% of people with ADHD have one or more co-occurring neurological conditions. So dyslexia, reading disabilities, math disabilities, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder.
Holly, will I be able to take a picture of that and put it on, email it out, or is it copyrighted?
No, you could do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Come here with me, I'll take pictures.
Okay, great. Great. So questions. And there can be questions about ADHD separate from what I've talked about. Yes?
Last year or the year before, you mentioned neurofeedback and like juries, how it's feel about its effectiveness. Any more information?
Yeah. Neurofeedback. The FDA approved it, but they didn't do research studies in the way that they're supposed to do research studies. It makes a difference while you're doing it for some people and students, kids, but the benefits don't last. So it's something that has to continue to be done in order to be effective. So within a year, the benefits that are gained are gone. So it's not a cure for ADHD. If you've got the money and the time to spend on it and you want your child to be forever in neurofeedback, then it will make a difference. So it's like medication. Medication doesn't cure ADHD, but it makes a difference in the moment. Yeah, Jen?
I guess related to that, sort of, the Achilles?
Akili?
Yeah, are they already seeing results that it generalizes?
I don't know about generalizing, but they are seeing results. Yeah.
And better executive function skills?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, the UCSF neurology guy. Yeah. They're seeing results already. Yeah. Now whether those generalize or whether those last is a question that has to be answered. Yeah.
That's what they're studying right now.
That's what they're studying right now.
So one of my sons was one of the participants in that study.
One of your what?
My son
Your son?
He participated in that study.
Oh, yeah. And?
Well, according to the results, he improved after like 10 sessions of their version of the neurofeedback, well, the games and all that. But that was like 2 years ago. I'm not sure. We haven't done any testing to see whether those results are kind of.
So a parent here, son, did the Akili research, participated in that research study, and according to the research study, made gains, and it was about 2 years ago. And what areas did he make gains in? Can't remember.
He tested like 10 different areas.
Yeah.
And he made gains in all areas except for maybe 1 or 2.
So he made gains in almost all areas except maybe 1 or 2. But there hasn't been follow-up to see if it sustained.
Like a 3-month follow-up.
3-month follow-up.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's been about 2 years.
He's also ADHD, didn't qualify for it because it was just, they do an MRI of his brain, and it's just the way it's, I guess, the brain waves,
Mm-hmm.
so he didn't qualify for it. So they're not, it wasn't right for every person.
Yeah. You have to qualify for the study. Your brain has to be have some certain qualities to it in order to qualify for the study. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah?
You mentioned some resources for mindfulness with teens.
Yes.
Do you have any resources for younger kids?
You know, Mark Burton's other book, which is called something like Family Mindfulness Practices. Maybe somebody could look it up on their phone. It's Bertin, Mark with a K. And he has another book that addresses that. Yeah.
Family ADHD solution?
What is it called?
Mindfulness
Yes, that's it.
for ADHD.
What's it called? Family.
The Family ADHD solution?
Yes, the Family ADHD Solution.
So there's some resources around.
Yes. Yes. The family, say it again.
ADHD solution.
Yes. The Family ADHD Solution, that's it. That was his first book. Yes?
You know, so mindfulness is basically the practice of learning to calm yourself so you can calm your emotional.
It's the practice of being in the present moment in your mind, of directing your mind to the sensory input in the moment and paying attention to, in the moment, what's going through your mind, what you're experiencing in your body, and what the sensations are. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it reminds me so strongly of things I learned through practicing yoga.
Oh, yes.
Which I was led to because I have a really bad back, and I injured my back when I was very young, like 18 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And back then, no one really practiced yoga. It wasn't nearly,
Yeah.
35 years ago. It was just this much as popular and common as it is now. It's much more a fringe thing. But I had a family friend who was a teacher, and I learned through the yoga classes so much of how calming your mind can help really reduce the pain.
Mm-hmm.
Just the
Yeah.
pain and the stress that comes from the pain, and then I learned that heart doctors began using the same things to teach their patients to relieve the stress that causes all the fight or flight stuff, which causes heart attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I was given just a relaxation cassette
Mm-hmm.
from Sri Swami Satchidananda, which was just totally remarkable. I just listened to this tape and tense your muscles and breathe and relax.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like weird.
Yeah.
Saying all the same
No, those are mindfulness practices. They just weren't called that
Yeah.
back then because mindfulness practices covers a lot of practices. And yoga is a mindfulness practice.
Yeah.
And yoga has been found to help with the ADHD busy mind.
But there's also such a variety of yoga classes. You go to you know,
Right.
You can go to many, many yoga classes that don't have anything to do with, very little to do with it, much more physical.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just totally reminds me of that relaxation tape and how helpful it was.
Yeah. Do you want to spell it? Can you spell it?
I just Googled it. It's a mouthful.
This is a fellow. Oh, it isn't there.
He's dead. But, SRI is the first, and then his name is Swami, Satchidananda, Satchi, Dananda. How about that? It's just like it's spelled just like it sounds. Satchidananda. One more A. Yeah, right there. Satchidananda.
Dananda.
You know, if you have this,
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You
Or-
mentioned mind mapping,
Yeah.
but didn't say anything about it, so I wondered what it is.
Yeah. Look it up because there's a lot of different ways to do it. Has anybody here? Bye-bye. Has anybody here used mind mapping? Can you say something about it, Jen, and how you use it?
Well, I've used inspiration software, which is a mind mapping software, and there's a couple of other pretty popular ones. The way I understand it, it's like a graphic form of brainstorming, where you're using visual support for the associative type thinking that generates ideas and associations and relationships between ideas. So it's a web, another way to talk about it. A lot of kids with language issues will use like that for vocabulary development, and just inspiration will have bubbles, and you can connect the bubbles, and you can make ideas have different ranking, priority, and relationships with each other pretty easily. It's pretty user friendly. So it's a pretty broad, I don't know, flexible thing. I understand.
Yeah, it is pretty broad and flexible, and you know, if you Google it, you'll see lots of different ways. And inspiration software is a great one, and it's a way to visually, you know, sort of borrow executive functioning on paper so that the person can see what it is that they're doing. And you know, it's one of the problems with executive functioning is the working memory. That's like having too small a cutting board to make your recipe. And by being able to put it on paper, you've got a bigger cutting board, and you can hold and you can organize. And students visually sometimes do better than, you know, in their head with words. So it gives a picture of the organization, which I think is really helpful. And that's where inspiration software will even ask questions so that you can put things out there. Yeah. Other questions?
Yes, you mentioned advocate. So much of what you're talking about is getting the educational system to help our children that are on the spectrum of ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
Are there a lot of advocates out there? I've been very fortunate that my wife is in the educational system, so she was navigating it and
Yeah.
resulted in much better outcomes for our kids.
Yeah.
And I've talked to parents that are like, hey, how do I, you know, they didn't even know, like their kids having problems, they didn't even know what an IEP was.
Yeah.
And I felt guilty, you know, but because I was like, you know,
Get a wife who's in the field.
Yeah, exactly, that's very well. And, are there a lot of advocates? Are you an advocate?
I'm an advocate, yeah, and you know you can get an attorney. There are quite a few great attorneys in the Bay Area, and pay higher fees to get an advocate, and it'll really get the school's attention. But sometimes it creates some emotional stress for the parents. And then there are people around, like Diane Provo, you know, works as an advocate too. And you know, people can bring their friends who understand the system to the IEP meeting to work with them and to help them. So an advocate can even be somebody informal, or just having somebody else there who's been through the process can be helpful, and school districts tend to pay attention to that there's somebody else there observing, and they tend to give fewer misinformation, less information. Yeah.
Is Matrix a good resource for that?
Matrix does too. They've got, some limitations in that they have to maintain a reasonable relationship with the school districts. And so there's a certain, my experience is there's a certain point at which they're not going to push further. They'll support you to push further, but they're not going to go there in order to maintain their relationships with the school districts. Yeah.
You can tell by the noise that letting kids out and screaming is a good way to help them with their focusing.
Yeah, yeah,
They're very loud today.
yeah. They know we're over here and, needing quiet. And there's several of them that have on Santa hats, which is very cool. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Well, what's something that you're going to take with you from today? Just take a moment to reflect on something that you want to, utilize as a parent or as a professional that you learned, or maybe that you relearned.
Well, I think it's a really good reminder that living with a child with ADD and ADHD can be incredibly frustrating. The word I always comes out of my mouth is frustrating, and then I have to kind of try harder to take a step back and not get caught up in the moment of
Right.
reacting to what we're feeling is, at least in the moment, somewhat uncontrollable behavior.
Yep. It's interesting because,
Like what you said about the wheelchair. It's like, oh, you can see this person.
right, you have more compassion.
Yeah.
So one of the things interesting, there's been research done on mothers of children with autism. In fact, some was done here at UCSF, and it was found that those mothers, by the time they hit middle age, had a higher incidence than the regular population of stress-related major medical disorders. So like high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, related to too much adrenaline in their body over time. Well, it just came out recently that parents of children with ADHD end up having an even higher level of stress than parents of kids with autism. And, my question is why? And the thought is because children with autism, there's more compassion and sympathy for them, and less so when you have a kid with ADHD. So you're more likely to get the other parents when you're on the playground and your kid runs up the slide instead of going down the slide, to get parents that roll their eyes, rather than if it's a kid with autism, there tends to be a little more sympathy. So I don't know, and I don't know that they know yet why that is, but it's a really important thing to realize the level of stress on parents with kids with ADHD, and that, especially working in the profession, that you're going to have parents walking in who've been stressed for a long time and who are desperate for help and who may not behave real well at times because of their anxiety hijacking their frontal lobe. Yeah, and the importance of reducing your own stress and reactivity, as you said. And I think that, demonstrating to your kids that you can do that, you need a break, that you need to go sit down, that you need to go out for a walk, or you need, what you need, asking yourself, what do I need in order to calm down here so that I don't yell, or so that I stop yelling? And demonstrating that to your kids it's a really good way to teach them on how to handle their own reactivity. Yeah?
I love the reminder to name emotion.
The what?
The reminder, and why to name emotion.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, it seems so simple, and it seems like we all ought to be able to do it. But
When you're in it, it's hard.
when you're in it, it's hard. And when you're on the receiving end of it, it's hard because our cortisol and adrenaline is up, and we're not necessarily, tuned in and being empathic with the stress that's coming at us. What else?
It seems small, but I think it will unlock a lot for me, which is to recognize and help kids see that their coping, the avoidance works for them in the short term. So that's a piece of empathy that I think will help me connect better when I sit there thinking I have the answers and better strategies. And then paired with that to say, yes, these other things you might try. longer to work, and your way has immediately provided relief, and I understand that. And then, you know, you can get into a conversation about the problems with it, but I think I've been skipping that step.
Yeah, what else? So I wrote empathy for avoidance is coping and educate regarding the long-term solutions, providing relief long-term. And the empathy for that, you know, the desire for the short-term solution, and it's hard to hang in there for the second. Yeah. What else are you going to take with you?
I love how you talked about how the brain works and kind of the brain con and con man. I think a lot of times I avoid kind of talking about the brain with young kids because it seems high level.
Yeah.
Helping them understand how their brain works and externalizing it for them. Thank you.
You're welcome. Great. Yeah, externalizing it. Yeah, there's a woman, Cindy Goldrich, who's got, she was a teacher and she teaches teachers, she teaches parents too, that has some things on her website about the brain and teaching kids. And she teaches kids with their after she's taught them how to understand it, that neurons that fire together wire together so that effort put out on top of effort put out on top of effort put out builds something that bigger, so that and she'll ask kids, you know, what is it you need to do to get your neurons firing? So that helps get them out of avoidance because they've learned strategies to get their neurons firing, like this, just scribbling like this. That's a strategy to get your neurons firing. You're not writing yet, but you're headed in that direction. Yes? Anything else? Any other questions? Okay, I think we're going to wrap up then. Thank you for coming and participating and giving your ideas.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Oh, and these are, I think you saw that, just some resources for more information that are trusted, good resources.
Recess should be over, so it's all clear out there.